Well, hello, and welcome to the Waking Up Spiritually podcast. We're so thrilled to have you here. I'm Wendy Rose Williams. I'm a past life energy healer. I help people release pain, anxiety, depression, and other stuck energy that's not serving them. And the reason for our podcast, Waking Up Spiritually, is to help curious souls with those different experiences and symptoms and just craziness that can come with having such a major shift in your consciousness. And I'd like my wonderful co-host Gregg Kirk to introduce himself, and then we have an amazing guest today. I can't wait to jump in with. So, Gregg, take it away.
Yes, I'm Gregg Kirk. I'm an energy worker, a Lyme disease advocate, and a wellness coach who does remote and in-person energy healing. So you can come to my website at greggkirk.com. That's spelled GREGGKIRK.com, and come check out if you're interested in setting up an appointment. If you've got physical or energetic healing needs or Lyme disease informational needs and healing needs. And I also run weekly online group healing circles via Zoom. So click on the events link on my website. So, Wendy, I'm going to pull the deck up, and if you can explain what's about to happen, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So this podcast is a visual podcast, and you're welcome to, of course, listen any way you like to consume your information. But wakingupspiritually.com is where you will find the archive of all the different podcasts that Gregg and I have done over the 5+ years that we've been hosting this podcast. And that's where you'll find the various PowerPoints. So, Gregg, tell us about today's amazing guest.
Yes, we've got author, researcher, Mark Gober. So, Mark is the author of the Upside Down series of 7 books spanning the topics of consciousness, politics, economics, UFOs, medicine, cosmology, and more. His first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, which was published in 2018, won the IPPY Award for Best Science Book of the Year and was endorsed by researchers with affiliations at Harvard, Princeton, UVA, and UCSF, among others. He then wrote An End to Upside Down Living in 2020, An End to Upside Down Liberty in 2021, An End to Upside Down Contact 2022, An End to the Upside Down Reset 2023, and An End to Upside Down Medicine also in 2023, and An End to the Upside Down Cosmos in last year in 2024. Mark is also the host of an 8-episode podcast series, Where is My Mind?, released in 2019, which explores the scientific evidence for telepathy, the afterlife, and more. Additionally, since 2019, he has served on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. For more information, you can go to Mark's website at www.markgober.com. So, without further ado, let's bring Mark in. Here he comes.
Mark's going to join us from the waiting room.
Here he is. Hello, Mark.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Mark, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Your podcast, Where is My Mind? It is the best produced, most complex, thought-provoking podcast I think I've ever found. And I found it right back when you first produced it. Was that 2018 or 2019?
2019.
So clearly, you put major effort and expense, and it really, really shows. So highly recommend people check out Where is My Mind? And it might help to put in Mark's name. So Mark Gober, Gober, when you're searching for it. And Mark, you've got that marvelous free version available, and then people can do a deeper dive for a really small fee. Wasn't it? Is there like 60 hours of full interviews for just $33? Is that right?
Yeah, I conducted about 50 interviews, 50, and they range from, I don't know, on average, let's say 1 to 3 hours. There might be some that are slightly shorter or longer. So it's a lot of content there. But the 8-episode series is free, where I used clips from those longer interviews into a narrative where I was having a conversation basically with my producer from Blue Duck Media, Matt Ford. So your audience, if they're interested, they can just go on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and start with episode 1 because there's a sequence. And if you want more and to have the 60 plus hours, my website, markgober.com, has access to those for a one-time fee. And also 3 of those long form interviews are on YouTube, on my YouTube channel without subscribing.
Oh, fantastic. And what is the YouTube called?
That's a good question. I think it's just Mark Gober. If you search
Oh,
Mark Gober's YouTube channel,
okay,
you should
perfect.
be able to find it.
Perfect. So let's start back at the beginning of all this amazing information. How does a Wall Street investment banker write a book and all the research and all the things that led to it and all the exploration? How does a Wall Street banker win an award for the best science book of the year? I think that's the crux of a lot of your journey. And please correct me if I'm wrong and tell me other major changes that came up for you.
Yeah, it's funny talking about it now because we're really going to have to go back to around 2016, and we're 9 years removed from that. And it feels like almost a different life at this
Right.
point. It feels very distant. But if I bring my mind back to where I was at that point in 2016, I had just turned 30. I was on my way to becoming a partner at my firm in Silicon Valley. And prior to working in Silicon Valley, I worked in investment banking in New York. And prior to that, I was at Princeton. So I had this mainstream background and didn't really have a sense of meaning or purpose in life other than to try to achieve the next thing in front of me. And after a certain point, I hit a wall where I felt like I was on a treadmill and I didn't really know what I was doing, what I cared about, what I was even interested in. And that year in 2016, while I felt like I was a zombie, basically, I stumbled across podcasts initially, which led me to read books and scientific papers on the nature of consciousness. And the reason I got so hooked was that the implications of what I learned completely challenged my worldview. At the time, I was an agnostic or an atheist. Basically, I believed we lived in a universe that has no meaning built into it and that it's all random and that we're here by randomness, we die, and that's the end of our sense of experiencing life. Our consciousness goes away, and we can try to create meaning while we live, but we're really just rationalizing a universe that's inherently nihilistic. That's where I was. So when I learned about this information in 2016 about the nature of consciousness and the science of near-death experiences, the science of psychic phenomena, those sorts of things, they were pointing toward a reality that completely contradicted my worldview. It was pointing toward a reality that has meaning built into the fabric of reality and suggested maybe there's an afterlife, maybe there are other dimensions of experience that we don't ordinarily see. Maybe there's much more than meets the eye. And I had no exposure really to any of that in a credible way prior to 2016. And when I learned these things, it was very jarring. At first, it made sense. Some of the scientific papers I was coming across, or just the evidence and the convergence of evidence from so many different sources. But then I would go back into my day job and basically forget it because what I was learning about was pointing to a reality that was beyond the day to day. So I would go back to my job and it felt like taking a few steps back. And then I would go back to reading something or hearing a podcast, and then it would be a few steps forward. So it was this back and forth. And then I also engaged with many psychics and energy healers, people who were practicing the things I was reading about. And sometimes they were doing things that I couldn't explain with normal reasoning. So I was having this large body of evidence that was accumulating the more time I spent on it. And I basically exceeded a threshold at a certain point where I said, there's no going back here. There's too much that I've
Tipping
learned.
point.
Yeah, a tipping point. Yeah, I had many tipping points. I mean, some people, and maybe you've spoken to them, they'll have a more dramatic tipping point where they have a near-death experience or they had a psychedelic trip or they something happened to them in meditation. And all of a sudden there was no doubt that there is a broader reality. For me, it was much more gradual. I mean, it was still extreme happening within that year, but it felt more gradual and it's still ongoing today. So long story short, I became obsessed with this topic. And a year into the research,
of,
this
of
brings
consciousness.
yes, of consciousness, of the nature of reality. Who are we? Why are we here? When I wrote the book, which was in the summer of 2017, a year later, I realized that a lot of the things I was looking at all related to consciousness. But at the time when I was researching, I wouldn't have necessarily said, I'm researching the relationship between consciousness and the brain. I was more interested in what's the nature of reality. And I would spend a lot of time looking at, for example, the University of Virginia has a division of perceptual studies where they've studied over 2,500 cases of young children who remember a life that's not their own. And the researchers sometimes are able to validate the children's memories by finding historical records, or they'll find medical records that validate that the child said, I died in this manner. And they'll have birthmarks or physical defects in their body in this life. And the researchers can sometimes find medical records validating that there was some person dying in that manner in the past. These are just some examples. So I was coming across these types of phenomena, and I had an idea to try to summarize things that sounded like they were somewhat different. So, children with past life memories, that's a little bit different than a near death experience, which is a little bit different than someone having a psychedelic experience or someone claiming they had a telepathic ability, or they could know before someone, they would think of someone and then they would get a text shortly thereafter. So, these sort of like anomalous phenomena that I was finding, they all did relate to consciousness. And because I saw that common thread, I thought, there's room for a book in this domain to try to bring together these phenomena that are extremely important to our understanding of the nature of reality, but they're completely out of mainstream thinking. They certainly were not things I was taught at Princeton, not things I was thinking about in Silicon Valley or working in New York in investment banking. And I just couldn't believe that how could that be the case, is what I thought. How could there be so much evidence for these things? And the implications are so massive, and yet people don't know about it. So the goal with this,
Bug. And
it's
it's just not fitting. And we know that scientists can have a lot of pressure, and it just goes against what they're meant and can and should be doing, in my opinion, because it's like, oh, well, you've been funded for this, and I don't want to say we're looking for this result, but just there's fear factor for them.
and we have a lot of bias because most of the funding is going toward conventional topics that are established. So to fund something that contradicts a mainstream narrative is much more risky. And many academics will say that if you want to study these sorts of phenomena, they should be done outside of academia. And I actually joined the board of an organization called the Institute of Noetic Sciences. It was founded in 1973. I joined the board in 2019, and this is an independent organization that is able to study these phenomena outside of academia. But that is one organization compared to all the academic institutions around the world. So it still is in the minority, the ability to study these phenomena. But I think even since my first book came out in 2018, I wrote it in 2017, An End to Upside Down Thinking, there's been a lot of momentum since then.
Yes, and I love that IONS, the Institute for Noetic Sciences, was founded by an astronaut,
Mhm.
because he had such a life-altering, was it Edgar Mitchell, I
Yeah.
believe?
Yes.
And just had such a life-altering experience with seeing the Earth and different things as he was coming back, and just things that happened for him. So I think we're all just benefiting from that research.
I certainly benefited from it. I had no idea the organization existed, and I came across them in 2016, including Dr. Dean Radin, who's one of the most famous scientists in this area. He's actually the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And looking at his body of research and many others, I couldn't believe it. How could there be research suggesting that we have statistical evidence for psychic abilities in human beings, like telepathic abilities or precognitive abilities, being able to know or sense the future before it happens, and we're not taught this? That was the cognitive dissonance I was dealing with.
Right. And when you look at things like Wikipedia that have such a bias against it, it's really quite interesting. I've only read your first book, but I really can imagine that there's so much of just like trying to reset our thinking, and really getting back to the curiosity and just the scientific principles of how we explore, because so many people are having direct experiences, and then you can take that and you can put rigor to it. Is it replicable? And you can bring scientific inquiry to it. There's even at least one study that shows how our dogs are part of our pack, and they know when we're coming home. and there's a certain point. So if there's another person in the house, they know when you're coming home because you're within like a mile or two away, and you can be coming home at totally random times and via random transportation, and yet that dog will be waiting at the door for you because they just know that moment when you're like, oh, I'm almost home, I'm going home.
Yeah, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who's a former Cambridge biochemist, has
Yes.
studied this phenomenon. He wrote a book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, and the subtitle
Yes.
is something like "And Other Phenomena" along those lines. Because it's not just dogs, there are other animals too that seem to have these psychic abilities, and he's used traditional scientific means to test these things. And sometimes what the animals can do is happening beyond what chance would predict, which is indicative of some kind of a psychic connection.
Right,
He's
right.
amazing. He's done a lot of work on morphic fields, and he has also gone up against, because he's a, traditional, started off as a traditional scientist who has gone against the dogma of what he calls scientism. So you familiar with that, Mark? In fact, I just wanted to say something. I'm amazed that you're one of the few people that I know who's had an awakening experience without phenomena experience. That's incredible. So, but I'll bet you have had some of the side effects that we've all had. So once you start having experiences that you can't easily explain, logically what happened to you, and if you start telling people, they start thinking maybe you're ill or crazy or lost your mind or whatever, and you start to recoil that maybe I can't talk about this with a lot of people. In fact, this is the reason Wendy and I started this podcast. Did you start having those experiences as you kind of leapt out of your sphere of influence with your job and your background in education? You must have had that experience, right?
I had many synchronicities where there were occurrences in my life that I could not write off as chance, where the same thing would occur repeatedly, for example. And
Okay.
at a certain point, I would just note each one down in my phone as they occurred because
Okay.
there were so many of them. And I was using my logical mind to say, wait, what's the probability that this would happen? And I would see this word this many times, and then I would see this person. And it's usually not convincing to other people, but when it's happening to you, it's another piece of evidence. And that was occurring regularly. And like I said before, I also worked with many people who were practicing these phenomena, psychic abilities and channeling and energy healing. And encountering those people in action and seeing what they could do sometimes was very valuable to me.
Yeah.
And that all of those experiences combined with the research I was doing, it was all jarring. It was all an awakening. But like I said, it's more gradual than we see for others.
Right. And didn't one of your friends express surprise? I was just re-listening to the first podcast last night, and he went over to your apartment and said, like, dude, there's like 1,000. What is going on?
I remember that vividly. The stack of books was just growing and growing
You
in
you
San
drank
Francisco.
you
And
drank from the fire hose
yeah.
in a way, but yet the eloquence that you're able to express this journey and to have put pen to paper with 7 books in 7 years, it's really unheard of. So I'm just so appreciative of what you're doing, and this is just so fun to get to talk it through.
Thank you. Well, now that I'm a little more removed, even from the first book, there are just themes in thinking that I'm starting to come across. And basically where I land now is if I'm told something is true, I want to know why is it that that thing is believed to be true? What is the evidence? What are the foundational studies? What's the logic behind it? And that's exactly where I started with the nature of consciousness. I hadn't really thought to question some of the things that I believed. I just took them at face value. For example, the idea that consciousness, which is our capacity for experience, for example, it's the part of us that's aware. This is a general way to explain consciousness. But in any event, I was looking at the idea that consciousness perhaps doesn't just pop out of our brain. I had assumed that consciousness does come out of our brain because there's a field of neuroscience that examines the things that are happening in the brain and how that's correlated to the way that we experience life. For example, a person gets in a car accident and damages the part of the brain responsible for vision, and then the person has a change in the way they see the world. So we can see, look, we change this part of the brain and their consciousness changes. So there are these tight correlations between brain experience and conscious activity. And there's an assumption that then the brain is what is producing our conscious experience. And that's not necessarily true, just on face value, based on logic, because you can have two things that are correlated, but not necessarily indicating a causal relationship. In the same way that there are firefighters that are correlated with the size of a fire, for example. So if you have a large fire, there might be more firefighters at the scene. We don't conclude that the firefighters caused the fire. In reality, the firefighters emerge at the scene because they're putting out the fire. So it's this relationship of cause and effect. There's another term I've been talking about more recently. It's called affirming the consequence. It's a name for this logical fallacy. The fancy way of saying it is, if X, then Y therefore X. The simpler way of saying it is, if it rains, the grass outside will be wet. Statement two, I observed that the grass outside is wet, therefore it rained. The second statement is a big problem because there are many reasons grass can be wet that have nothing to do with rain, like dew or sprinkler systems or children pouring buckets of water on the grass. And what happens in many domains of science and elsewhere is that we get locked into a model of how reality works because we say, oh, this model can explain an observation. We observed wet grass and we know that rain causes wet grass, therefore it rained. We know the brain is correlated with consciousness. So yeah, if the brain created consciousness, we would see those correlations. Therefore, the brain creates consciousness. Versus, is there another way to explain the correlation between brain activity and conscious experience? Maybe it didn't rain and that's why there's wet grass. Maybe the brain is like an antenna receiver or a filtering mechanism or an interface. And consciousness, this very abstract thing, is well beyond the body and the brain, and we're somehow tapping into it. We would also see correlations between brain activity and conscious experience in the same way that if we had a television set and we're watching TV, we take a hammer and smash the antenna on the top of the set. All of a sudden, the television show is appearing on the screen in a very scratchy manner. We can't watch it as clearly. And we don't conclude that the signal was damaged in that process. All that happened was that the antenna or the apparatus that was receiving the signal was damaged. So certainly the receiver itself has a correlation with what we see on the television screen, but it has nothing to do with the signal itself.
Exactly.
So it might be that the brain is like this processing mechanism and we're picking up a signal.
Yeah, I really love that analogy. I was going to say the brain is like a lens, but I like the idea of a television set because it's receiving signals and it's you can change the channel and things like that, but it's not it's not creating the programs that you're seeing, right. It's not creating the signal. So yeah, really great analogy.
Mm-hmm. And yep. Can you speak to in the first podcast there was this wonderful analogy of trying to explain consciousness as a stream of water and the various whirlpools. Could you walk us through that one? Because I think that's just a great starting point for a lot of people to start to be open to some of these possibilities. Because what we're really talking about here in many ways is simply using your own critical thinking and your own discernment, because we all get to choose what we believe, and that's one of our greatest freedoms.
Well, the conventional view of consciousness is that consciousness pops out of the brain, but more generally, that consciousness comes out of the material world, so that at the basis of reality, we can find these tiny little billiard balls, quarks, subatomic particles, little tiny things that are interacting with each other, which leads to this universe that we're in, including human beings who have brains, and then consciousness pops out. That's the materialistic view, scientific materialism, also known as physicalism. And what you're describing, Wendy, is an alternative to that, which is described very well by Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, a philosopher who I interviewed for my podcast in 2019, Where is My Mind? His analogy is that the materialist view is not correct, that consciousness doesn't come from the brain. The universe is not fundamentally made out of matter, but rather consciousness is the fundamental aspect of all reality itself. So to quote Max Planck, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, in 1931, he said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. So it's a reversal of the materialistic view, hence the title of my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. So with this perspective that consciousness is fundamental, it's really hard, if you've never heard that before, it takes some time to think about, because usually we think about consciousness in our brain, but if consciousness is fundamental, maybe it's the underlying part of all reality, and everything we experience in the world is just a different modulation of consciousness, as Rupert Spira says. So to go back to Dr. Bernardo Kastrup's analogy, he says, if all reality is like consciousness, it's sort of like having an infinite stream of water, where water is analogous to consciousness. And each individual is like a whirlpool within the stream, meaning there's a sense of being an individual because you're an individual whirlpool, but you're also just water within the stream. And it creates this paradox of both interconnectivity and separation coexisting. And that framework, even if it's not exactly precise, because maybe reality is way more complex, it's a way to reconcile so many phenomena that we see in the world, and it's able to accommodate things like a psychic phenomenon. Because if some of the water from my whirlpool gets into your whirlpool, by analogy, that's like some of my consciousness getting into your consciousness, a psychic phenomenon. And under this framework that Kastrup describes, it's not even paranormal. You would expect psychic phenomena to exist because we're all in the same stream. And likewise, if a whirlpool delocalizes and stops being a whirlpool, it's like water flowing back into that broader stream, and maybe it even reconfigures into a new whirlpool. So the water's never leaving the stream. And by analogy, maybe our consciousness doesn't actually die when the body dies. It just transitions into a new form and might even transition into a new whirlpool, like this notion of reincarnation. So the idea from this alternative framework that consciousness is fundamental, all of a sudden we now have to consider the real possibility that psychic phenomena exist and that consciousness does not die when the physical body dies.
Absolutely.
It's profound, and it really is a really great way. I think it's a useful analogy and framework for how to look at it. So that's great. Gregg, do you have questions? And I'm just going to look at my notes here for other questions that I have.
Yeah. So I love, again, your analogies line up with my experiences and my research. Basically, the idea that consciousness is the universal experience, and we're all a part of the main creator consciousness, but we have individuality. So we have our own identity, but we're connected. I look at it more like a nervous system where there is a main infinite intelligence that we're all connected to. So we're ends of the nerves, but we're all having an experience and we're all connected. So it's in the books, The Law of One, they say there's no differentiation between creator and creation. We're all a part of the body of infinite intelligence. It's very much what you just said about the water and the whirlpools. I really like it. It's funny because, as humans, we get all caught up in the separateness experience, right? And when we can close it off and not realize that we are threads in the same fabric. And
depending on the culture too, because certainly some cultures are more the rugged individualism. Hello, we do live in the United States, the three of us at this time.
Yeah. Yes. So what's surprised you the most in your research, Mark? I mean, what was, aside from your initial epiphanies, as you've been going along researching, what has really opened your eyes in the last few years?
How much of science and really the world is based on inference? The things that we believe are not typically based on direct evidence.
Oh.
So, for example, there is this belief that consciousness comes out of the brain. Most people would say that's true. But no one's ever seen consciousness popping out of a brain.
Right.
We can apply this to so many other areas. And I find that it occurs at the very, very small scales, microscopic levels, and also at the cosmic scales, where we can't actually directly observe. So we come up with a model and we see wet grass and we say, oh, well, if it rained, that would explain the wet grass. And it's never the direct evidence of the thing. And it can lead to real problems, because if we believe consciousness comes out of the brain, even though no one's ever observed that, and we know there are many other possibilities, logically speaking, then we could get stuck into where I used to be, which is that life is random and meaningless, and when we die, that's the end. And
Right.
What if that's an incorrect view? Then that could lead to a very misguided life.
Right. I've always said that I think there's direct evidence that consciousness actually has a weight, because when they weigh somebody before they die, and then they weigh the body after they die, it's 21 grams lighter, I believe. And so how do you explain that? The only thing that's changed is the consciousness has left. So apparently something's changed. I would love it if that were studied a little further to see if our consciousness actually does have like a physical weight to it, because there's potential evidence that it does. So,
Me too. I've heard that, and I would love to see more science on it of how and when those shifts occur.
right, exactly.
Right. Mark, what's next for you? Are you working on another book or books, or what do you think might be
Hmm.
next?
I really don't know. I've said this many times over the last almost 10 years where I get hooked on something and then there's a lull period. My last book came out in the fall of 2024, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos. Since then, I have not had a new inspiration. I do spend a bunch of time doing podcasts and speaking publicly, but I have not had a new inspiration, so I don't know what's next.
Understand. And what a wrap up. The cosmos.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of perfect. And that makes perfect sense. And I think we're meant to just have those lulls and then just be comfortable, waiting for what the next inspiration is.
Well, what I've learned about the creative process, and this ties very much to our discussion of consciousness, is that I don't feel like I'm the one creating it. The inspiration will come to me. And then it's almost like I have an option to say yes or no to it and
Yeah.
follow it and follow the breadcrumbs. So until that happens, it's really out of my control. That's what it feels like. So I kind of sit and wait for lightning to strike, so to speak. And if it doesn't, that's beyond my control. And as I always say after I write a book, I may never write another book again.
As a musician, I can relate to that. You can't force it. It's got to come to you. So,
Took the words out of my mouth. There's
yeah,
not forced creativity.
right.
It's just
I'm
and
curious, Mark, how the UFO experiencers and those stories made it into your purview, while you were doing this research. How did that happen?
It's very relevant to our discussion about consciousness. Really, it ties into all my books because the metaphysical framework in which reality exists will inform every discipline of study because we have to know where do we exist? What is this place? And what's a human being in order to evaluate something like cosmology or the UFO phenomenon, for example. And I think we've all heard on the news recently in many of these political press conferences and hearings and things like that, that there is questioning about the nature of crafts in the sky and whether they're drones or whether they're coming from other places. I think all that's a very valid area of inquiry, which I do discuss in my book, An End to Upside Down Contact. But I also spend a lot of time looking at consciousness because incidents of people encountering non-human intelligence and having contact with them, it doesn't always involve something physical. It can be in the realm of their consciousness. For example, a psychedelic experience, depending on the substance taken, there are commonalities in terms of the types of beings that people experience. Or in a near-death state, when a person, let's say they're in cardiac arrest and there's little or no brain activity, yet they find their consciousness hovering over their body. They accurately describe things from that vantage point, and then when they're resuscitated, they come and tell their family members and the doctors what they saw, and they can validate that those memories were accurate. What happens often in those near-death experiences is that people will encounter a being of light, or what they would call a religious figure, or deceased relatives, or other beings that they're actually interacting with, deceased pets. These, all of them, and there are many other examples, these are examples of contact with non-human intelligence. And until we start thinking about consciousness beyond the brain, I think the UFO phenomenon will be viewed in too narrow a view. And we have to think about the multidimensional aspects of all of this. I'll give an example, and I'll start with the most credible one. John Mack, who was the head of psychiatry at Harvard and a Pulitzer Prize winner. Head of psychiatry at Harvard, Pulitzer Prize winner. I want to give that preface because late in his career, he started studying what's known as alien abductions. He wrote a book called Abduction and then another one called Passport to the Cosmos. And these are very scientifically done books where people had these encounters with beings, very specific types of bizarre things that they talked about. But independent of John Mack's analysis of these people, and as a psychiatrist, he was trying to study, are these people lying? Are they all delusional? He concluded that something was going on. They were actually encountering beings. But go to a totally different domain. Rick Strassman's work at the University of New Mexico, studying the psychedelic compound DMT, dimethyltryptamine. He was giving it to people intravenously. And sometimes they were describing encounters with intelligences that sounded just like these alleged alien abductions. And he did not have much knowledge of the phenomenon, and many of his participants in the studies, they had never heard of this phenomenon either. So he said, I'm paraphrasing, he would say, I regret to inform this, but I have to now look at the alien abduction phenomenon to see what's going on separately because my participants in these studies are encountering beings. So John Mack from Harvard actually endorsed Rick Strassman's book DMT, the Spirit Molecule. These two domains that sound completely different, they're
Wow.
converging on evidence of intelligences that seem to be able to interact with human beings or at least human consciousness.
Fascinating. Yeah, I've heard about the DMT stuff, and that even Joe Rogan talks about it because he's a fan of that. But where it seems to be a common experience where these people experience these gnome-like beings. I believe that's the way they look. So, and they can be friendly or they can be impish, or it depends, on the
Yeah.
situation. But yeah, I didn't know there was people bridging the gap between UFO experiences or even interdimensional experiences. I guess you could say, because some ETs absolutely have the ability to travel through dimensions, and I've always heard craft that can go faster than the speed of light. To really, what you're dealing with there is a time machine. It can move fast enough to pass through seamlessly through time. So why not also dimensions? So anyway, yeah, it's all possible, isn't it?
And
So
to me, it's all possible once we get out of the materialistic view that consciousness is just stuck inside of our skull. Once we go to this whirlpool and a stream analogy and maybe extend it to a multidimensional stream with multidimensional whirlpools,
yeah,
then a lot is possible. And so many of the ancient traditions around the world, and I talk about this in the book, An End to Upside Down Contact, they will speak of phenomena in their lore about advanced beings that were either teaching them things, or maybe they were benevolent, maybe they weren't, but they were interacting with these cultures. Sometimes it was through channeling, for example, where the being would like speak through a person's vocal cords, which, by the way, has been studied at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Helene Wabe wrote a book called The Science of Channeling. My point is that there is a lot of historical precedent around the world for contact phenomena, interdimensional intelligence, apparently, higher intelligence that is interacting with and influencing our society. So this is probably something ancient, and it ties to the question of consciousness and the nature of reality itself.
100%. Graham Hancock's recent docu-series on Netflix called Ancient Apocalypse, his second series, speaks directly to that, basically saying there are indigenous cultures across the globe in different continents all have they have a flood story with specifics, and after the flood happened, then some being either came out of the water, the air, underground, came out and helped them rebuild their society and gave them really advanced technologies or
Right.
abilities to make megalithic stone structures and
So they please explain Easter Island,
oh yeah,
the pyramids, just different things like that.
there's a
It's
lot of stuff even in Peru where it looks like these massive stones weighing tons have been kind of melted or kind of smushed together. It looks like the stone had been softened, and there's no mortar in between the stones. Like you talk to a mason today and say, how can you replicate that? And you can't. So clearly they had some help, or they, at the very least, they had knowledge. A lot of people kind of bristle and say, oh, you're turning everything into the ETs came and taught them how to do it. Well, maybe it was an interdimensional being or somebody else. Somebody taught them. And as you said, it could have come through channeling, it could have come through ayahuasca experience or something like that, where an interdimensional being came in, gave them this information, and now they have medicine. They've got these megalithic structures, and they've built a society that when you look back at the Mayans and the Aztecs, they had these massive cities that rivaled anything that was going on that we're more tuned into, at least in our culture. In the West, things happening in Europe or Greece or Rome, much bigger. Some of the biggest structures in the world, and pyramids as well, which isn't that interesting? We've got pyramids on every continent. So
Exactly. So once we depart from the materialist paradigm about the nature of reality and realize there's so many other possibilities, then we have to question all the narratives, including our own historical narrative. And how do we know the things we're told in the history books are true, especially when we're dealing with things that were a long time ago? I mean, I speak about this in my book on cosmology. The Big Bang allegedly occurred 13.8 billion years ago. And for us to think we know what happened that long ago
Right.
is a bit of arrogance. We
Yes.
might observe things and then create a model. Again, we see wet grass and we say, well, rain would explain that, and then forget all the other ones. And I think the further back we go, we get more and more potentially locked into these false models. We come up with one model that can explain the wet grass, and we say that's it. And then we fund all the research around the idea that it rained, and we don't look at all the other ones. And I think history is a big example of that.
Absolutely. And I mean, there
100%.
was oral tradition for thousands and thousands of years. But, think of that game of telephone that you may have played as a kid where you sit in a circle and you whisper into the ear of the kid next to you. And I mean, the story that comes out 4, 6, 8 kids later is very garbled.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, to your point, the Big Bang, is that the way it happened? And then evolution happened, and then we ended up where we are. I mean, there's plenty of things to show that, like even just with evolution, yes, their evolution works. Go to the Galapagos Islands. Obviously, there's birds and other species there that have adapted to, live better lives, get feed better, but there's nothing that really explains the jump in consciousness, the jump in brain size, the jump in um, evolution that we've experienced as human beings just in the past 10,000, 20,000 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Greg, were you referring to in there, is it called the 100th monkey effect of once, that many in a species learn
No,
something
I'm talking
new?
about the missing link idea, where all of
Ah,
a sudden you're finding all these bones of
okay.
these ape-like beings, or Cro-Mag or Australopithecus, and then suddenly there's modern man,
Okay.
and it's like,
Okay.
what happened there? There's a
The missing chapters in this book.
right, exactly, and they used to call it the missing link, back in the '60s. But
Okay.
have you done any research on that, Mark? Do you have any thoughts about how there was just a sudden leap in, and even in technology just in the past 100 years?
Right.
What are your
Yeah, I know
thoughts
that
on
there are some unexplained elements of the traditional Darwinian narrative for sure.
that?
But even if we take it back further, let's go back to the Big Bang, because in order for the evolutionary time frame to work, you need the 13.8 billion years of a universe and everything that happened and all the time on Earth of the things that they allege have happened that we could never directly verify, but we're told to believe they happened. But let's take it all the way back to the beginning. Apparently, there was this rapid inflation at the Big Bang, the rapid expansion
Mhm.
13.8 billion years ago in order for all this to work. The problem is there's no known mechanism for how that could have occurred. So physicists have theorized there's a particle called an inflaton that caused the rapid inflation in the early universe around the Big Bang. The problem is no one has ever found an inflaton particle. So, I mean, you could just think about the ripple effects of that. It's like a house of cards where you need these entities to exist in order for an entire framework, including Darwinian evolution, to work. And then if you think about dark matter and dark energy, which there's evidence, for example, dark matter has been falsified by an astrophysicist named Pavel Krupa. You need these entities, dark matter and dark energy, to uphold so much of physics, which you need in order to uphold the timeline for what Earth is and all the things that have allegedly happened here. So when you peel back the onion, you realize how much of our belief system is based on inference.
Yeah. Well, again, back to Rupert Sheldrake. He calls it scientism, and
Mhm.
I saw him give a speech about the idea that the speed of light is not a constant. For instance, it changes, it fluctuates. But his scientist friends said, "Oh, we solved the problem. We made it. We created a constant. So they just decided, oh, speed of light is this, and that's the way it's going to be. It helps us do our equations. We can stack all of our theories on top of it, and it's a solid structure. But the problem is, it's not reality."
Well, we use human constructs all the time. I mean, think about time. We've agreed on the human construct of past, present, and future.
Mm-hmm.
Now we know that's not accurate, and we know it's oversimplified, and that time is continuous, and you can get into quantum entanglement, and there's so many. I mean, time in itself is just a mind bending topic.
Right. Yeah.
So it's interesting. I mean, I totally get why we agree at certain points. Okay, this is the construct we're using, but then you have to be willing to rethink it and bring new critical thinking and new rigor to it, which clearly you've done, Mark, because you've got that precision of that. You've got that math brain, you've got that science brain, and you have a beautiful eloquence in how you were explaining these many complex topics. So I just really appreciate what you're doing. I highly recommend your books for anyone who wants to check those out. And I love that there's, I don't know if you did this in each book, but at least in the first one, that there's also a summary at the end of each chapter, because it's kind of like having your brain blown up. Like, woo, now I need to put back together again here. And then you go through another chapter. Or for those who are more auditory, just enjoy Where Is Your Mind podcast, and you can do the truncated version with the beautiful little tight 8 episodes, like the highlight clip, but just with you and your producer friend, kind of talking people through it, which kept it real also, because there were so many wonderful quotes and high level interviews, but then people can also choose, hey, I want more, I want to do that deep dive and jump into the 60 full length. So it's a beautiful approach.
Thank
So
you. Well, I give credit to Matt Ford and Gabe Goodwin at Blue Duck Media because they really encouraged that format of having the narrative that people could just listen to on the subway or in the gym, the bingeable version.
right.
And then those who want to hear the full length 60 plus hours, they can do that too. I found that most people have opted not to do the 60 plus hours, but the ones who have told me that it was very impactful. And for me to conduct those interviews was helpful reinforcement for all the research I had done to actually get to speak to these scientists and experiencers to really just like hammer it home for me. And
Right.
now, I mean, in some ways I'm still adjusting to it, but in other ways I'm numb to it, that these phenomena are real and that there's so much scientific evidence. It's almost just like, okay, that's real. So now what? Now let's look at everything else. What's actually going on here? Who are we? How should I be living life? And that's more the mode I've been in since the
Right.
first book.
Right. Absolutely. Well, any parting words of wisdom, or please share your full contact information again, or Gregg, if you have any additional questions. This has just been really an honor, and I so appreciate you taking the time, Mark.
Yeah, I just wondered if, is there a common thread or just a thought that you'd like to leave our listeners with that just kind of crystallizes all the work that you've done? Is there anything that kind of comes out that you'd like to say to our audience?
The thing that comes to mind, in addition to what I said before, which I will reinforce, is that if we're told something is true, the burden of proof is on the person or the entity that's making the positive claim.
Hmm.
They're the ones who have to validate the thing they're saying, and often it gets inverted. Where if you ask a question, they'll say, "Well, where's your proof for that alternative?" No, the burden of proof is on the one who makes the claim. So we should always be asking when we're told something is true, to really understand how we know that thing to be true and whether that's actually based on sound evidence and assumptions. So that's just one general idea. Another is on the nature of causation in general. Because with this materialistic view of reality, that everything is material at the core, it's almost like we're envisioning these billiard balls, tiny, tiny billiard balls. One hits the next, and it's a linear form of causation. It's because this one billiard ball hit the next one, and that's why things are happening. And we can trace it back to the first billiard ball. Whereas when we depart from materialism, when we see that there is something non-physical underlying reality, and maybe it's consciousness or something like that, this whirlpools in a stream, that we're all just sort of modulations or frequencies within that stream, then the nature of causation is very different because we don't know how the stream is making things happen within the stream. And it might not be that it's just one billiard ball hitting the next. It might be nonlinear. And it might be that there's an intelligence underlying causation and why things happen. So that perspective then I think can help with this notion of surrender versus trying to control life. If we believe that there's an underlying intelligence that is guiding and governing the things that happen, the goal then becomes to align ourselves with the current in the stream rather than to try to control everything, because control is actually based on faulty assumptions about how reality works. So my life has been an example of that. There are many people who do it as well, but I've been, since getting into this topic and thinking about the implications of departing from materialism and thinking there's meaning built into the fabric of reality and that there's an intelligence, I now try to align myself with the nature of reality, and I act when things are present, but I'm less interested in trying to control things. And I understand that sometimes things happen for reasons that I can't understand. So rather than getting overly upset about something, I try more to understand what's happening. And of course, there could be emotions that come with it, but I say, okay, maybe there's a reason this is happening. And it's steering me in a certain direction that I, with my feeble mind and my materialist bias that I maybe still haven't gotten out of it, that wants to control everything, maybe there's something, another reason that this is occurring.
So just be in the moment and fully experience it, and just see what unexpected doors might be opening.
You've
Yes.
just described, Wendy and I did an episode a while ago where we said the idea life isn't happening to you, it's happening for you. You just described that precisely. That how do we know what's best for us from this low level perspective that we're in, and these experiences that are coming towards us, we're trying to control them and change them. Maybe we just let them happen because the good stuff is coming.
Well, control's an illusion, and it's based on fear typically. So it's
Typically, yeah.
hard to get out of that place sometimes, and just open your heart and just experience it. And as you said, just look at, what's really happening. And I think, just opening our mind to having things be delightful surprises rather than, because it's a trauma response of, oh, didn't expect that. Oh, lockdown. Oh, fear. Oh, not good.
Fear of the unknown. Yes.
Right. And just letting it be like, look at that. Wow. Wonder what's next.
Right.
So,
Mark, thank you. Thank you so much.
so
Lovely interview. What's that?
Best way for people to reach you, Mark, via your website at markgober.com?
Yeah, it's markgober.com. I also have, all my books are on Amazon, so you can go right there. There's 7 of them currently. They're all available in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats. I narrate the Audibles myself. And again, Where Is My Mind podcast is on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the major players for the 8-episode series, the narrative version, but also the 60 plus hours of full length interviews are at my website, markgober.com.
Fantastic. And we'll include all the links to that. And Gregg, if we could also include the links to the episode we did with Simon Bound, because what Mark was saying about the verified NDEs fits in perfectly with that recent episode, as well as, of course, the one with Tony Rodriguez, being such an incredible experiencer with what he went through and helps people with. So,
yes.
All right. Well, great.
All right.
So let's start to wrap up then, and we'll lead you through the rest of the PowerPoint here and take everybody through some upcoming events.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
All right, Mark, and you can take off. We're just gonna finish out here. So
okay.
you don't need to stay for this, but you can if you want.
Thank you for having me.
Conversation. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And upcoming events with me, please visit my website, which is wendyrosewilliams.com, and go to the events tab. I have a group past life regression coming up on June 21st. I'll be doing a live channeling, which is a healing opportunity with the Masters, Ascended Masters and Angels on July 19th, and how to connect with your guide on August 2nd. Regression Healing 2, Joe and Marilyn, is available in audiobook format as well as paperback and on Kindle. I like Mark have the different formats available because we all have different preferences. I consume them all different ways too. So appreciated this kind review on Amazon of someone stating that they found the book Joe and Marilyn wildly interesting. And if you're curious about past life regression therapy or broadening your horizons in the medical physical field, check out that book. And you can also hear the backstory to how some of my Joe and Marilyn experience came up on the Ask Julie Ryan show. So I link that here. And Julie was a marvelous guest for us, talking about angelic attendance and the assistance that we get when we pass on. And she's just got a beautiful framework there.
Yes. Just want to remind everybody about my book, which you can look for it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or my website at greggkirk.com. And this is my story about going through Lyme disease and coming out the other side with a spiritual awakening and in personal empowerment. I'm working on the second book, which I hope to have finished by the end of this year. And I'll keep you all in tune with that and we'll make an announcement once it's up and ready to go.
Wonderful. Looking forward to it, Gregg. Can't wait to read it. Please join us on July 14th, and I'll be doing a live channeling of Mary Magdalene and the Ascended Masters, and look forward to that every year. I would do it in honor of Mary Magdalene's birthday, Mary Magdalene Day. And visit me at my website, which is wendyrosewilliams.com, and then visit the wakingupspiritually.com website to find our broadcasts. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. So here is the link for that. And we so appreciate you rating and reviewing us on Apple iTunes, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Visit Gregg. He's got some wonderful programs available. I've so benefited from the energy healing sessions I've done with Gregg at Gregg, Gregg, Kirk, KIRK.com, or visit me at wendyrosewilliams.com. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
Bye-bye.